So, just from a geopolitical perspective, I said before, you know, CO2 emissions, we're misinformed about it a whole lot. Okay. As far as what we emit, which again, we're going to see here, it's not much compared to what is the total in the atmosphere. But let's just look at the countries represented here. United States, you know, we can go back to like the mid 1800s, not much. Made about 1900. The US is, you know, leading the way, higher than anybody. Then around 2000, that's when China took over. And since 2000, the United States has been reducing its emissions. Okay. All these little European countries pretty much weren't emitting much at all, and they're reducing. Okay. And then you got India, which is on a rapid increase, but just not as high as China yet, but China's just going through the roof. Okay. So geopolitically, unless you can stop China and India, those would be your targets, really, from emitting carbon dioxide, which the Paris Climate Accord exempts them, right? So the only countries that are included in the Paris Climate Accord are countries that are already essentially reducing CO2 emissions. So you would not be reducing CO2 emissions in the first place. Okay, so it's from a policy perspective, it's nonsense for the U.S. to be part of that kind of a treaty, and that's not political. That's just common sense. Because if our emissions are going down and we're exempting the emissions of the countries that are skyrocketing, then the math doesn't add up. You're allowing more emissions essentially. So you're just strapping your own country economically, and not actually solving the problem you're proposing exists. Okay, but it goes a step further than that. Because let's just say we could theoretically put all these emissions to zero. Let's say like some technology comes out or is released that we already have, for example, and now the carbon emissions and climate change idea is a moot point, right? Because there are no carbon emissions anymore. Right? I mean, it's hypothetical. We're just speaking hypothetics. But even if we drop it to zero, what I want you to see is that it wouldn't make much of a difference at all. Okay, so don't mind these two right here for a minute. Over here, this is the composition of the atmosphere. Okay, so nitrogen makes up about 78%, that whole yellow. Oxygen, we get a lot of oxygen, about 21%. That's the blue. That's almost the whole atmosphere right there. Is nitrogen and oxygen. Argon, you know, that's not even 1%, right? Just under. Then we finally get to CO2. There's other stuff in the atmosphere too, but this is just to show, you know, some relative comparisons. So that green square, that's CO2. It's not 4% of the atmosphere. It's not even 0.4% of the atmosphere. It is 0.04% of the atmosphere. So we're talking, and this has nothing to do with the human emissions. This has to do with mostly natural CO2. So the percent of that 0.04% that is from humans is minuscule. Okay, minuscule. And so that white right there is all of this. Okay, so even that huge jump from China is still almost nothing. Okay, I mean that's like this is high value information. Okay, and that could be like a slap in the face to the idea, because I saw a couple of videos where they were interviewing like politicians, representatives, people that have been elected to the House and the Senate and whatnot, and asking them just candidly, like, what percentage of the atmosphere do you think is CO2? And their answers range from like 5%, which is like, you know, that's going to be more than 100 times what it actually is, right? And then people are saying like 30% and things like that, right? And it's literally one. If you divided the atmosphere into 2,500 parts, one of those parts is carbon dioxide, and more than 90% of that is natural. That's what this high value information tells us. Okay. Another thing with so again, even if we regulate carbon, it doesn't affect the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, because that carbon again is naturally skyrocketing. Like I said, I could show you that study David Dilley did. Right at the end of each interglacial. That's just what happens. Okay, so we are not responsible for that spike. We're responsible for a part of it. This is not zero, right? This is here, but it's so minuscule compared to what's there. So even if we could control every amount of carbon dioxide emissions from humans, it would make zero difference. And if it would make zero difference, then even if CO2 had the heating effect we're told that it does, then it would be out of our control. You see, it would be nature doing it. But the good news is that the heating effect of CO2 is limited. It's kind of like it's what you call saturated, right? So if you paint a wall, that first stroke of paint, that first coat of paint, makes a big difference. So like that first 20 parts per million of carbon dioxide makes a huge difference. It does have a warming effect. But then the next 20, the next 20% or 20 parts per million, sorry, that is a significantly less warming effect. And then significantly less from there. Pretty much you get around like 150 parts per million, and that's when it's pretty much maxed out. Like you're barely getting any warming effect, anything along those lines. And 150 parts per million, like this says here, that's when plant growth shuts down. So if you don't have at least that much, every bit of life on Earth dies. There's no life on Earth anymore. Okay, and we were dangerously close to that during the last glaciation, which again at around 20,000 years ago is when we had our rapid warming that has led us to where we are now in the interglacial, which was natural. That we were at about 180 parts. We were only 30 parts per million above the crisis zone. So, but fortunately, carbon dioxide naturally rose, right? And so we were able to have life. And then this is pre-industrial levels here. That was level in 2010. This is old, but where we're at now is about 420, a little over 420. But you can see, like, I mean, there hasn't been an effect in the whole industrial time. There hasn't been a warming effect. There hasn't been an ability to warm because, like, again, painting a wall, each coat of paint has less and less of an effect, right? That first coat makes a big difference. The second coat makes some difference, but not as much. And by the time you get the third and fourth coat, it doesn't matter how many coats you put on, you're not making a difference, okay? And so even if we double pre-industrial levels, we're up here in this level, which is, what they talk about wanting, that's going to be devastating and everything. It's not, because this is just the physics of it. Again, just high value information, just like this is, just debunks the whole idea of carbon dioxide being, having the ability to warm, and more importantly, the human contributions to it, even making a difference to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, never mind are, adding to warming, right? And actually, this is a great study done by Boston University. It studied 1982 to 2015. So that over that period, if you look at the graph, anything green and toward the dark green is going to be a net positive as far as leaf area, and anything like yellow to like orange or whatnot is going to be a net negative. Okay, so you can see there are some patches of like the oranges and yellows and whatnot, but for the most part, I mean, this whole Earth looks pretty green. Okay, and what that study concluded was that the only logical conclusion they can come from is that it's this increase in carbon dioxide that we've had over that period. And again, most of that is natural. We can't pat ourselves in the back and say, hey, because we've been burning fossil fuels, we're greening the planet. It's not true, because our amount is so insignificant relative to the natural amount. But being at the end of an interglacial, or again, we're about to enter the next glaciation, it'll take a while. I wouldn't worry about it. It's going to take thousands of years for the glaciers to form and then spread down into the continents. But that spike in CO2 is really helping plant growth throughout the world. And before we take a little break here, just to show you another thing when it comes to the idea of warming being dangerous, okay, or that we're in some kind of extraordinarily warm period, for example. The 1990 IPCC report, which is basically the UN, this is their Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and so it's UN. So it's globalist special interest. The very first report, they do reports every several years. The very first one included these two graphs. These graphs are literally from that report. So they're literally just cut out. That's exactly what they had in those reports, was these two graphs. Okay, the first one goes back about 10,000 years. So this is our interglacial. Remember, if we go back here, we're in this interglacial right here. So this is just stretching or concentrating this area. So this coming out of that 20,000 years ago, whoop, we warmed up, and then this is where we are now. And this is the interglacial. Okay, and so the peak of this interglacial, the maximum warm period, was about 5 to 8,000 years ago. You see that in that range? That's a lot warmer than we are now. Okay, and during that time, it's interesting to note, like if you see the Sahara Desert today, Northern Africa, just all sand. It's just the desert all through and through. And then, but if we look at it 6,000 years ago, this is what it looked like. So when we were in, when it was warmer, we had a lot more life going on. There was lakes, there was rivers, there was, lots of wildlife. There were humans here, 6,000 years ago is not that long ago from a human perspective. Like Homo sapiens were around then. Okay. So very different landscape. So the climate changed dramatically from this to that as it cooled. Okay. So cooling had a negative effect on the environment. That's natural cooling having a negative effect. And that's true across the board, because now if we take this 1,000-year period, so starting about here, now we're going to stretch this out, and that's what this graph is. Okay, so it's just going back about 1,000 years. So that little hump right there is this medieval warm period. That dip, that was heading into the Little Ice Age, and then now we're into the modern period. The modern period, not as warm as the medieval warm period. So that period from like 1,000 AD to 1,200, 1,300 or so AD, very warm. Okay, there. Just to take England as an example, England was growing grapes, creating wine during that period. Okay, during the Little Ice Age, the Thames River in London would regularly freeze every winter to the point where they had festivals on the ice. They could plan them. Okay, it was going to freeze over every single year. Okay, back in the medieval warm period, when they were making grapes and growing wine, growing grapes and making wine, the Thames River did not freeze. And in the modern era, the Thames River does not freeze, but they can't make wine in England. Okay, so that just shows it. And that's just like your biological proof of where we're at relative in terms of relative temperature to different periods of time. And what's also interesting is that when this drastic cooling was happening, okay, just like this cooling here, which is even more drastic, caused this climate change. Well, this cooling, caused mountain glaciers to come into towns and whatnot and crush homes and buildings and things like that in like Switzerland and places like that. But also this is when a lot of females were getting burned at the stake, being accused of being witches, okay, because they were accused of using witchcraft to change the climate, to hurt the crops, essentially, because crops like warm, crops don't like cold. You want longer growing seasons, you don't want shorter growing seasons, okay? And the shorter growing seasons were blamed on witchcraft. And then just to reiterate that, the idea that cold-related death or heat-related deaths, what's more common, so these are in percent of, out of 100,000 people, but we're like right around 9 to 10, 8 to 10% is typical for cold weather deaths per 100,000 people, but only around 1% per 100,000 people for heat-related issues. So humans are adapted to the heat. We have sweat glands. It's easier to cool off when it's hot than it is to warm up when it's cold. If you don't have fire, if you don't have shelter, the cold is not gonna be good for us. So the whole philosophy of heat being bad and having to prevent it, so if climate change was about CO2 causing warming, that it's like, well, what's wrong with that, right? But I think the good news is, based on high value information, we know that number one, warming is actually good. It has always been good throughout history, and we don't have enough. CO2 doesn't have enough effect. Doesn't have enough warming effect like we sit here once you get saturated, and the amount that we're responsible for doesn't make a difference anyway. Okay, so this will be a good time for a break, and we'll be back in just a minute. All right, so welcome back. So yeah, a lot of information there, I understand, and thank you for sitting through that and for sharing if you're finding it very interesting. And I just want to talk about now what we're here for, really, because I've kind of set up this whole the whole way that the Saturn-Neptune cycle works. Okay, how it's worked in the last two cycles, how we're coming out of the final this recent cycle, and how we're seeing the breakdown. Essentially, we're going to see more of that breakdown of the narratives and the themes from that. Anyway, so Saturn-Neptune, there's 0 degrees Aries. It's not happening in isolation. Okay, like I mentioned, it being the rise of the individual before, but it's especially true because it's going to happen in the vicinity of a sextile to Pluto and Aquarius, which we all know is very powerful for societal transformation, and in the vicinity of a sextile to Uranus and Gemini, and those two planets will be in a trine to each other. So it's all three outer planets, the evolutionary planets, with Saturn anchoring them in at the center, at the 0 degrees Aries point. So, I mean, you can't reiterate enough how significant that is in terms of anchoring in a new societal evolution. Okay, so it's like, in my opinion, we're done with being ruled, by overlords, essentially, right? The top-down rule, the manipulation of information, etc. And we're at a time where, like, we're coming into freedom, and are we going to see technologies that result in medical and other technological advances that essentially free us? It could be literally have technologies that eliminate the need to use carbon-based forms for energy, which basically makes the Berlin Wall fall, essentially, right? I'm calling the climate change the Berlin Wall of this cycle, where it just becomes a moot point, and all this effort to regulate carbon emissions and get the policies together become a moot point, because we have the technology to not have it make a difference anyway, even though the math didn't add up in the first place, like we saw with the high value information that we showed before. But it would just make the story a complete moot point. But yeah, Pluto would be in Aquarius through 2044, Neptune and Aries through 2039, and then Uranus and Gemini through 2033. So at least into the early 30s, this is all kind of in effect. And so we're going to see, in my opinion, a very, very rapid change. And it's going to be so different from anything that we've been around. I think, a lot of us are here on a soul level for this transition. Okay. But anyway, some astrological context to where we're at at the very, tail end of the Saturn-Neptune in Capricorn cycle. Okay. One bigger, so we're going to follow Neptune and Saturn in Pisces, because I think that's important, since Pisces is the final sign of the zodiac. And then those two planets are what we're talking about. They're meeting up in Aries, right? So we have to talk about, what we're getting rid of before we talk about what we're going to build, right? So Neptune in Pisces since 2011. It was in Pisces for about 4 months in 2011, then officially in February 2012 it entered, and it was in Pisces all the way up until March 30th, and now it's in Aries for a little while until October, before it goes back into Pisces and then back into Aries, where it'll be for good. And so this whole time period, Neptune being the ruler of Pisces, the modern ruler of Pisces, has, one of the negative sides of it is that it's deception, right? And confusion, right? It's very spiritual, and so I think this has been a very spiritually awakening time, but maybe spiritually awakening because of the deceit. People are waking up to deceit, and that is the awakening, right? Waking up to the deception. And I think Neptune going through Pisces has just kind of been this karmic time of those in power, kind of like the man behind the curtain kind of situation, right? Deceiving us, and then it becoming obvious, and then therefore the end of that deception, that period of deception, has to happen, and then the new birth, which is Neptune and Aries, when we can fully actualize ourselves essentially in this body. If you think of Neptune and Aries in that way. And so this has been the era of fact checkers, which is really narrative reinforcement. So you can also think of Neptune and Pisces as the narrative, right? That's the title of this talk, Narrative to Discernment. So it's all about painting the picture, painting the narrative. And so it's very similar to Thought Police, with Orwellian kind of concepts, for example. This has also been the era of tech censorship, right? Blanket censorship. When we get into like the 2020 era, it got really ramped up, right? But also victim consciousness, right? Definitely a time of, a lot like trying to win the oppression Olympics, essentially, right? That's been, one of the more negative sides of Neptune and Pisces. But again, all this negative stuff has been to drive the positive, which is that spiritual awakening, that final awakening into the reality. And so what goes along with that, and if we look at the percentage of Americans who have confidence in newspapers and television news, that has dropped since the mid 90s, right? And the big reason for that is like the final chapter with Neptune and Pisces is the deceptions that are becoming more obvious, right? Same thing here with average total viewers. You got the big networks really dropping off like a rock, right? Now it goes from 24. So this is the Neptune and Pisces era right here, right? A couple years after Neptune's in Pisces, drops off like a rock. Okay, it's getting harder and harder for the deception to happen. So like here's a nice little meme, and I think another great thing that came from Neptune and Pisces is the meme, right? If a picture's worth 1,000 words, then a picture with a few words on it is worth even more, right? So now it's time to go over the carefully selected stories that have been chosen to manipulate your emotions and your thinking. Very Neptune and Pisces. Okay, here's just a quick little rundown of different policies and things or in organizations that were involved in the timeline of manipulating media, for example. So it goes all the way back to like the Council on Foreign Relations, 1921. This is when it was getting well known that people were too informed, essentially. So magazines like Time Magazine, et cetera, were purchased and owned by like the wealthiest people. The Rockefellers and the JP Morgan and things like that. The Council on Foreign Relations was created to create the global narratives about what's going on in the world. United Nations, that was formed after World War II. That kind of morphed into like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum, the UN's IPCC, like we talked about before, for climate change. In the 1950s, there was the CIA involvement in the media, which was Operation Mockingbird, if you're not familiar with that. Very interesting. It's not a theory. There's some 1970s Senate hearings where there are senators that are actually grilling CIA agents and asking them about their involvement in the media, because this is just a way to try to manipulate public opinion. In the 1980s, when at the beginning of the 80s, there was a lot of different media companies. By the end of the 80s, there was only like 6. Okay, so big media consolidation that upped the ante as far as controlling the message in the masses. The Telecommunications Act, we don't really have to talk about too much, has a lot to do with the rise of the internet and the idea of platforms. Section 230 was protecting platforms. So, like for example, Facebook can't get sued because someone said something on Facebook, right? It's like they're not liable for what someone said. That it was just protecting them because it's not a publisher; it's a platform. Okay. Anyway, a couple of astrological things that happened that are very significant that we're going to talk about here briefly is the Venus occultation cycle in Gemini, which the most recent one happened in 2004, 2012, and then the fixed star Regulus entered Virgo in 2011, and those both happened. The end of that Venus occultation and that fixed star entering Virgo happened right around the time of the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, which happened right after Neptune entered Pisces for good, for good meaning for the next 13, 14 years. And that was an act it was a modernization of an act that came out in 1948. Okay. And then this other bill we won't really talk about too much, but this is significant. The Smith-Mundt Act, I should say, in 1948, what that was, this post-World War II. And so what that was basically a law that was set in place in the US that basically said, yeah, we're allowed to use propaganda to influence, voting in other countries to go our way, et cetera. We can, influence public officials. We can do all these kind of things. We can, use funds to like fund certain, politicians and whatnot, but we can't turn that on American citizens. That's what the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948 said. What the Smith-Mundt Act, that when it was modernized in 2012, which was again right after Neptune entered Pisces when things got foggy, was that, oh, by the way, yeah, we can use that on Americans now. Okay, and this is when the media got really divisive, because before that, there was a sense of like seeing both sides, having different opinions, right? But at the start, when that started, that's when narrative development really exploded. This is basically Neptune and Pisces going nuts, right? So they really created two different sides, totally different narratives, right? And it created a split in the populace, okay? But it happened at a very awakening time with that Venus occultation in Gemini, fixed star Regulus. So we're going to talk about how that comes together, okay? Just an example of the mainstream media, and now that we're in this post Smith-Mundt modernization time, so now we can be propagandized. Now it's legal to propagandize Americans and to also fund politicians and judges and things like that on the inside here. We're not just doing other countries, we're doing it to ourselves. So an example, so on the left-hand side is pre-Ukraine-Russia crisis. In The Guardian, they're actually criticizing the Ukraine here. Welcome to the Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe. Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem, right? You can't say that now. A Ukrainian comedian turned president is embroiled in Trump's impeachment mess. Ukrainian president's rule becomes increasingly corrupt, authoritarian. So actually referring to Zelensky as authoritarian, like you'd never hear that in our media now. right? Because now post-Ukraine crisis, the fight for Ukraine is a fight for liberal ideals. For foreign fighters, Ukraine offers purpose, camaraderie, and a cause. Ukrainians are giving 2 lessons in democracy that Americans have forgotten. And then now, instead of criticizing Zelensky as an authoritarian, we have Zelensky, the TV president turned war hero. So you can see how it's just a matter of phrasing and creating that narrative. So this is Neptune and Pisces just in action, right? With, again, on a policy level, that's that Smith-Mundt Modernization Act that happened right at the time that Neptune entered Pisces. Okay, so I mentioned the Venus occultation, very important shift we went through that finished in 2012. These happen once every 21 years. They always happen in Gemini. And so an occultation is basically an eclipse. It's when Venus crosses the sun. Okay, it's small, it's too far away, so it doesn't block the sun. It's not something you see. You're not going to notice any darkness when Venus crosses the sun, but it's significant. And it has to do, because it's in Gemini, it has to do with connection consciousness. Every time it goes through a round, it happens in a pair. It's 8 years apart. So the last one was 1874, 1882. And then we just had our most recent one in 2004 and then 2012. Okay, so at the end of that one was right around when that Smith-Mundt Modernization Act happened, right around when Neptune entered Pisces, etc. So each round represents kind of like a ratchet up in human consciousness. If you want to think of it like that. And in this case, specifically connectivity consciousness, right? Connection consciousness. And a great way to look at it is like, prior to 1874, the only way you could communicate at a long distance was with letters, which could take weeks to months to get to someone. By the time we got to the end of that window, now we had electricity, we had phones. Okay, so theoretically, you could communicate with anyone anywhere in the world in an instant, no matter where you are. I mean, it wasn't technologically feasible as far as like logistics go, because it wasn't, they didn't exist everywhere. But theoretically, anyway, you had the technology existed if the infrastructure was present to do that. So a very different paradigm of communication happened there. In the most recent one that started in 2004, ended in 2012, this one is, I think, a little more obvious. I mean, 2004, for example, is when Facebook started. Okay, so this is basically the rise of social media. Prior to 2004, we had the internet, we had cell phones, but we didn't have the internet. The social media web that we have today, where information can spread like wildfire, right? Where people can be connected, where you could connect with multiple people, over space and time. Okay, by the time we got out of that window, now it was theoretically possible, even though maybe not technologically feasible, but theoretically possible with the rise of YouTube, with other social media platforms, things like that, where it was possible that anyone, you don't have to be a famous person or a politician or something, any individual theoretically could reach every individual at one time. Again, bandwidth aside, it's theoretically possible. Like if I make this video, it's theoretically possible that every single person on the planet could see it, right? As long as they have internet access, right? Because it's on YouTube. So it's possible that everyone could see it. It's probably not going to happen, but I'm just saying that it's possible, right? And that paradigm didn't exist prior to June 2004, right? Only the privileged could really put information out there. Now anyone could put information out there. Okay, so we're in a very different space than we were in other recent times. So it's just interesting that like the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act happened almost like as a desperate act to start propagandizing and manipulating our opinions and our perceptions of reality, right at a time when we're awakening to the ability to not have that happen anymore. Okay, so well timed. The other thing I mentioned was Regulus moving from Leo into Virgo. So it's very slow moving. We're talking like 150 BC till right up until 2011. Okay, that's when it entered Virgo, and like it says here, it's a 2100 year cycle. I mean, it's going to be in Virgo for a while, but it was in Leo for a while, and pretty much anyone watching this right now, unless you're about 90 or older, or if you're 13 or younger, has actually unless you're 13 or under, you have Regulus in Leo. But anyone who's younger than 90 or so has Regulus at the 29th degree of Leo, which is the critical degree, which we're going to talk about in a second. So as one of the 4 royal stars, this portends great change for humanity as it transitions from a kingly or aristocratic age to one of service and humility, right? Leo to Virgo. So the power will shift from the rich and noble class to the common working people, who will no longer be looked upon as ignorant slaves, but who will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. So this goes back to the Venus occultation. Like I said, though, anyone can reach everyone, right? You don't have to be a somebody. That's the concept. So right around the same time that happened, we have this happening, right? Where everybody matters. The working class, you don't have to be a noble class, for example. And that's just that transition there. And so the next slide, we're going to talk about, again, talk about timing. Remember before I said that, the global, there was no more left and right. There was just the globalist left and globalist right, starting with Bush Sr. and, everyone that came before them. And then in 2016, it was supposed to be another globalist, globalist leftist. Hillary Clinton was supposed to be president. And then that would have taken us to where we are now. But it got, it got disrupted. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But just a quick overview of Regulus and Leo versus Regulus and Virgo. Again, 29 degrees Leo, anyone born in the late 30s to about 2011. So that's pretty much everyone, except for those people that are about 13 and younger and about 90 and older, have Leo at 29 degrees. Have Regulus at 29 degrees of Leo. And this transition really has a lot to do with transition from separation consciousness, codependence, and connection consciousness, which leads to sovereignty. So if you believe you're connected, then you can live sovereignly. If you believe you're separated, then that's when codependence is created. But anyway, Regulus and Leo is, imbalance, masculine and feminine. There's this hierarchy of authority. There's collectivism, which is like, we always hear fascism and communism, etc. It comes from this hierarchy of authority. Centralization of power, which includes also electric power, right? So centralization of electric grids and whatnot. Also allopathic medicine, so thinking of the body as like mechanical parts. A big thing that happened, especially with Regulus at 29 degrees Leo, was the rise of sports and entertainment and politicians as like gods, right? So since the late 1930s, like starting with like Kennedy on TV with Nixon, that was the first time people actually saw presidents debating on TV. And it showed how charisma can make a difference, right? And in sports, we saw the rise, especially once we got into like the late part of the 1900s, where the salaries of sporting, of people that play sports, professional sports, just ridiculously skyrocketed, right? So that goes with the Regulus and Leo, that imbalance, right, of power. Also entertainment. We started worshiping celebrities, worshiping politicians, worshiping athletes, okay? That came with, again, Regulus at 29 degrees Leo. And then also part of that is, Earth as a resource, extraction source, and then our value as far as how useful we are to the state. Okay, that's what matters. With Regulus and Virgo, now we get a more masculine, feminine balance, decentralization of authority. So, Virgo has to do with the pieces, right? The individual pieces and the details. So decentralization of authority. Okay, microgrids as far as energy sources are concerned. Comprehensive medicine, holistic, individualized, right? We're not just machines, like one medicine works for you, another one works for another person. So individualized plan approach to medicine. Sovereign empowerment. So instead of worshiping people outside of us, we are, we're staying, holding closer to our principles, etc. Like, and you can see how, there have been attempts, recently to almost enforce this old Regulus and Leo habit, with this idea. Like, the idea is like you used to be able to throw, celebrities with a certain politician, and that would give them more clout, for example. And that didn't really work in the most recent presidential election, right? Who was getting all the celebrity endorsements, right? And that person didn't win, right? Because people don't care about celebrity opinions anymore, right? And so that's just a good example. Also, like this whole flight, this Blue Origin that went up here recently. It's just like famous people, and it didn't go over well. Okay, like it was a very Regulus and Leo move. The idea to kind of mesmerize the public with like this stunt, and it didn't have the effect that they wanted. And the reason for that is, that's why I have the cell phone picture here, is that all of us being born with Regulus and Leo, especially those from the late 30s to 2011, because you have 29 degrees Leo, we're still charged essentially with that Regulus and Leo energy because we were born with it, right? Now there's no place to recharge So as time goes on, we're only 13 years into Regulus in Virgo, that charge is going to wear out. And the only place to recharge is from the Regulus in Virgo. And that's why, like, over time, all attempts at Regulus in Leo methods of like hierarchy of authority, of celebrity worship, etc., that's all kind of falling away. Okay. And so the person that actually really is, well timed when he arrived on the scene in a significant way is someone that not only has Regulus at 29 degrees Leo, but that has Regulus at 29 degrees Leo rising. Like literally 29th degree of Leo is Donald Trump's rising degree. Okay, so